Okay,
Yes.
so welcome everyone to the second session of ELLISxUniReps speaker series. Today is a great pleasure. We have Mariya Toneva and Lenka Tětková as our speakers. Our session, like last time, our session consists of three different parts. So first of all, we'll start with a keynote talk for 30 minutes by Mariya, and then followed by a flash talk of 15 minutes by Lenka. Note that we will have a shared Q&A session for 15 minutes after both talks. So if you have questions in between, you can just write in the chat and we speak up directly in the Q&A session with our speakers. So now let me introduce our keynote speaker today. Mariya is a tenure-track faculty member at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems, where she leads the Bridging AI and Neuroscience group. The aberration is brain, which is super cool name. Her research is at the intersection of machine learning, natural language processing, and neuroscience, with a focus on building computational models of language processing in the brain that can also improve natural language processing systems. So, Mariya, we can't wait to hear more about your research. The floor is yours. I will stop sharing.
Great. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Dingling, and for inviting me and also for organizing this really nice speaker series. I really look forward to staying in touch and following the next speakers. Let me share. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Yeah, so thanks everybody. Thanks for joining today. I'm really excited to tell you about the work in our group, which is to align large language models directly to the human brain. So this might sound a little bit like sci-fi. So first off, why would I even want to do this? Why would I want to improve the alignment between large language models and the human brain? So I want to do this for mainly two reasons. The first one is that as we move towards a society in which we collaborate more and more with language models, it may be useful to have a similar way in which we as humans represent the world and reason with the language models. And so having this larger degree of alignment between the language models and our brains and the way we process language may actually ensure more efficient and trustworthy collaboration between us. So of course, this is a hypothesis, it needs to be tested, but this is one reason why I'm excited about this, improving this alignment. The second reason is more scientific. So in this second reason, I'm excited about this improvement because I believe this will help us have better model organisms of language processing in the human brain. So for other cognitive functions like vision and memory, neuroscientists have used animal model organisms. So for example, cats and monkeys for vision and rats and mice for memory and spatial navigation. In order to really learn about the mechanisms in the brain that allow this cognitive function to actually happen. But for language, we don't really have any animal that's capable of the kind of language abilities that we're capable of. And language models really come the closest to that, to our abilities. And still, as I'll show you, they're still not perfect. They don't perfectly represent us. So improving this alignment between language models and the human brain, I believe, will help us have even better model organisms and learn more about the mechanisms of language in the human brain. So before I tell you about how we improve this alignment, let me first tell you about the standard ways in which this alignment, the current level of alignment between language models and brains is measured. So this is a standard approach that's used in many groups, including ours. And so in this approach, we take a natural stimulus, like a chapter of a book, and somebody, a participant, is reading this chapter word by word or is listening to the audiobook version of this chapter. And then we present the same stimulus to a language model as input. And then we can extract representations from the language model at particular layers. And we can also look at specific activations in specific regions of the brain where we know language model is processed. Language is processed. And so now that we have representations of the same text, one from the language model and one from the brain, we can calculate what we call the alignment between the two. So we can estimate this alignment, and we can do this in different ways. A very common way is to estimate a simple function f, which predicts each XYZ, the activity in each XYZ coordinate in the brain as a function of the language model activations, where both the activations and in the model and in the brain are elicited by the same text. And so in order to test how well we can do this prediction, we can make predictions for some held out brain recordings and then compare these predictions to the real brain activity. So just one more slide on this, how we learn this function f. It's typically a linear function. So this is a very common assumption in the field. And there is evidence that nonlinear functions can lead to better alignment in some specific brain regions. But all the results I'll be telling you about today are coming from this assumption of a linear function f. And this is really good enough to show a substantial level of alignment already. So how do we actually train this function? We use standard machine learning techniques. So we use cross-validation, and we regularize the learning via a rich parameter. And so the important part here is actually how we evaluate this function f. So we do this in 3 steps in order to make sure that the actual alignment is substantial and significant. So we make predictions for held out data, of course, and then we can correlate the predictions with the true brain data. So we can do this via, let's say, Pearson correlation. So at the end, for each XYZ coordinate in the brain, we would get a 1 brain alignment score, which would be between -1 and 1. And the last very important step is that we need to do stringent hypothesis testing to actually know that this final brain alignment value in each XYZ coordinate of the brain is different from chance. So typically this is a permutation test followed by a multiple comparison and correction. So all the results I'll show you today have passed through this line of evaluation steps. So even if, let's say, a particular value looks small to you, as an absolute value, it actually has survived all these statistical tests. Okay, so given this pipeline of estimating the language model brain alignment, what do we actually know about the alignments that already exist in pre-trained language models? So what we found is that about current pre-trained language models can predict about 60 to 70% of the explainable variance, estimated explainable variance in some high-level language regions in the brain. So this is a really substantial number, and it's more than double the number that previous computational models of language were able to predict in the brain. But still, it still leaves about 30 to 40% of this estimated explainable variance left for us to actually improve this alignment. Another finding is that if you look at the information processing hierarchy in the model, which people have shown to increase from bottom layers to top layers, and we map that onto the brain, we see that about layers that are mid to late layers, so layers that are 2/3 into the model, are the ones that predict these high-level language regions the best. And this is a finding that's been replicated several times since our work here. And so this was surprising because, for example, if you contrast this to similar work in vision, people there have shown that models that are trained to do scene classification or object classification, the later you go into those models, the more you map onto later semantic visual processing in the brain. And so this is a really surprising and interesting divergence from language models, because here we see that the deeper you go into the model, actually the worse you predict the brain after some point. And in another work, we actually showed that this is partially due to syntax. So these layers that are 2/3 into the model are also the layers that are really encode syntax really well. And so if you do an intervention to remove syntactic information from the model, you actually can see that this pattern of layers that are 2/3 into the model aligning really well with language models disappears. So we see that this alignment between text-based language models and the brain is driven by syntax to some large degree, especially in these middle layers of the model. Okay, so we see that there are some things that we know about why pre-trained models align with the brain, and also there's some room to grow in terms of alignments and improving this alignment. So how do we think about this improvement? Well, in our group, we take two general approaches. One approach is to think about new training objectives that are much longer range than the next word short range prediction objective. So for example, in one work from a few years back, we looked at the summarization objective as a training objective of models and compared a model that's trained to summarize narratives to one that's just trained on language modeling. And what we showed is that training language models to further summarize narratives indeed improved brain alignment significantly. And this was really exciting because it was the first work to show that we can use a different kind of task as a training objective, the beyond language modeling, to actually improve this alignment between the two. And so we are investigating other kinds of longer range training objectives and architectures as well in the group currently. But the second direction I wanted to tell you about today, that I'll spend more time talking about, is this direction of what we're calling brain tuning, which is direct optimization of the model parameters in order to improve the prediction of the brain data. So essentially fine-tuning a language model with the target of prediction of brain recordings. And so in this work that I will be telling you more about today, we found that brain tuning improves speech-language model semantic understanding. So I will tell you exactly how we evaluated that. But this was really exciting because it was the first work to show a very strong downstream benefit of brain tuning of language models. And here we're talking about using really a drop in the bucket in terms of data when compared to the pre-training amount of data that these models are trained on. And so this was a very exciting result and encouraging for the future of improving LM to brain alignment. Okay, so the majority of the talk will be spent talking about this work here. So first I wanted to tell you about why we thought this would be something good to do. Why would we think that we could improve speech models using brain recordings? Well, in the previous work, we found that the reason why speech models aligned with the human brain was really because of encoding low-level speech features, so not things that have to do with meaning. So if we, for example, remove such low-level of speech features from the speech model representations and we predict the brain activity, we see a huge decrease in the ability to actually align with the brain. So here what we're showing is the percentage of decrease in brain alignment after we remove some low-level speech properties, such as the number of phonemes in a particular word. So information that's linearly related to that. And I'll tell you about how we do this removal in a second. But I just want you here to take away this fact that this low-level speech features are really important for the alignment of speech models with the brain, even in regions of the brain where we think process semantics. And this is really concerning because when we predict semantic regions of the brain, we want to predict them because of semantics and not because of some confounded, correlated, low-level feature. And so let me just tell you briefly, I'll spend 2 slides on how we actually do this kind of removal, so you get a better idea. And so here, this removal is done via what we call computational control. So this is the standard pipeline for fitting encoding models to estimate brain alignment. So we have a naturalistic stimulus, we extract representations from it, from language models, and we present it to a person, either via reading or listening, and then we can estimate the alignment. So now this, in addition to this, this arm of this pipeline, we have a second branch in which we actually estimate these low-level features so for example, this kind of low-level feature here is the length of a word or the number of characters in a word, which also correlates with the number of phonemes in a word, or other kinds of features are different features of the spectrogram for speech model. And so now that we have this annotation for this low-level features that correspond to the natural stimulus, we can build a function to predict the model representations as a function of this low-level feature. And then we essentially can remove any information that's linearly related to this low-level feature. And linearly because this f is a linear function. And why linear? Well, the final function that we use to predict the brain is a linear function. So essentially, it's sufficient to remove linearly related information to these low-level features in order to remove information that then has a downstream effect on the brain alignment. And so finally, we can calculate this residual alignment after we remove this low-level feature information. And if there's a significant difference between this original and residual alignment, then we can say that the low-level feature affected the actual alignment, the original alignment that we get. And so this is kind of an approach we've developed over the years, and we've used it several different times to learn different things about the reasons for alignment between language models and the brain. But here in this specific work, we were really focusing on speech models and these low-level features. So our takeaway from that was that the speech language models lack brain-relevant semantics, because the reason why they align with semantic regions in the brain are these low-level speech properties. And if we remove them, we go down to essentially chance-level performance at predicting these semantic regions. So this motivated us to ask the question of, can we improve speech models via improving their alignment to the human brain? Because we see that they capture very different signals, especially when it comes to semantics. So in this line of work, which is led by a PhD student in our group, Omar Musa, Omar wanted to improve this alignment by specifically optimizing the language model for prediction of fMRI recordings. And so here, Omar used data from Lebel et al., which is Moth Radio Hour data set. So it's a data set of people listening to a radio podcast. So it's naturalistic, it's very engaging stories, and it's about 6.4 hours of audio per participant. And so the training approach was quite simple. So here we masked voxels or XYZ coordinates in the brain that had very low signal-to-noise ratio. So we were able to estimate this. And we only used voxels for training that actually had high signal-to-noise ratio, so that we're not introducing extra noise into the training process. And we use mean squared error training loss. So this was kind of the simplest thing we could try, and it actually worked. And we're now working on improving this and making it more efficient. But the first step here was actually quite interesting. And so I wanted to tell you more about how we evaluate the effect of this brain tuning on the model's actual semantic understanding. So we evaluate this in 3 ways. The first one is to actually see how the model is now predicting some held out brain recordings in these late language regions which are doing semantic processing. So this is the first step. It's sort of the lowest bar we want to meet. So we're training the model to do this. So hopefully it can generalize to new data. The second one is, how does brain tuning affect the low-level feature impact in brain alignment? So if, for example, we are indeed able to increase the semantic understanding of the models, then we would expect the low-level feature impact to decrease on brain alignment, because we saw that this impact was very large for the pre-trained language models, and in fact, all of the substantial brain alignment was due to these low-level features. So we expect that this would decrease. And finally, we want to, of course, evaluate on downstream tasks that require semantics. And if the model is able to better capture semantic understanding, then we would expect higher performance on these semantic tasks. So let's first focus on the brain alignment. So here we brain-tuned 3 model families, which are state-of-the-art across speech models, so Wave2Vec, 2.0, Hubert, and Whisper. And here the pre-trained model is appearing in this very light green/white. and the brain-tuned one is in dark green, and then the other one in the middle is a baseline model. Focus on the other two for now, and I can tell you more about the baselines later. But here the takeaway is that indeed we can improve the brain alignment especially with semantic language regions via brain tuning for some held out brain recordings for 2 of these 3 model families. So this was, of course, good. And again, we're training the model to do this, and it's good that it generalizes to new data. So now what happens to the low-level feature impact? What we see is that this low-level feature impact indeed decreases for all of the 3 model families. So even for Whisper, in which we saw that brain tuning did not substantially improve the alignment in late language regions, we still see that brain tuning is able to reduce the effect of low-level speech features on this alignment, which is very comforting because we are aiming to improve the semantic understanding of the models, and the fact that there's less impact of low-level features on the alignment is some evidence towards this. And now the last part is the downstream performance, which we wanted to evaluate via a suite of tasks that had a range of different semantic understanding. And what we see is that indeed brain tuning improves the language model performance on these downstream semantic tasks, which was really comforting to see. And again, it's sort of 3 lines of evidence that by incorporating brain data into the training process, we're able to augment the semantic understanding of the model. And one last result from this work that I wanted to share is that what brain tuning can also do is that it can bridge the gap between how small and large language models predict brain activity. So here, again, in white/light green, we have the pre-trained model, which is a base model. And then in the dark green, it's the same model, but brain-tuned version. And in orange, we have a large pre-trained model. And so we see that brain tuning the base model can lead to brain alignment that's very close to the one that's from the large pre-trained model. And not only that, but brain tuning also decreases the low-level feature impact on this alignment way more than in the pre-trained large language model. So again, this very good because what would be really nice is to be able to, if we wanted to use these models as what we're calling model organisms of listening in the brain, then we would want smaller models in which we can actually do interventions and understand the mechanisms, which is much harder to do in larger models. So to summarize here, we show for the first time that we can have a downstream benefit of actually including brain data in the training of speech language models. And this amount of data that we use is actually really, really tiny. So it's less than 1% of the data that these speech models are actually pre-trained with. And still, we show that this has such a substantial amount of effect on the semantic understanding of the models. And we are hoping that this can also improve the utility as model organisms of listening in the brain. And I'll show you just one follow-up work on this that we've recently done in this direction. And then again, to mirror what I just said, this we hope will allow us to use smaller models to serve as model organisms in order to help researchers do causal analysis in these models and understand their mechanisms. So then this other line of work in which we actually want to use models as better model organisms of the brain. Here, the same student, Omar, was asking, okay, so if these brain-tuned models actually do reflect language processing in the brain better, then what happens when we examine the hierarchy of information processing in these models and compare that to the brain? So as we saw in the beginning, the best alignment with the language model typically happens before brain tuning, around 2/3 into the model. So once we brain tune, does this alignment actually shift closer to the end of the model? And we indeed see this. We see that as we brain tune different versions of the models, we see that later layers of the models become more aligned with late language regions. And this is not the case for other kinds of regions. So for example, for early auditory regions, we don't see this improvement in alignments for late layers in the model. And so this is one point of evidence towards being able to have better hierarchical speech processing in models that reflects the hierarchical speech processing in the brain. Okay, so far we've made some progress towards this improvement of alignment between language models and the human brain. And this is, again, I'm excited about this for these two main reasons, in which the first one was that it will hopefully help us ensure more efficient and trustworthy collaborations, but there's many more open questions left to address. And so I wanted to go through some of them with you. Maybe this will inspire some discussion or potential collaborations going forward. So for this first direction, one question is, okay, so we've shown that this kind of brain tuning technique is really helpful for speech language models, but what about brain tuning text-based language models, which are much larger, and of course would require also more data if we're being realistic, right? So then we really need to answer the question of what are the most efficient ways to actually brain tune these language models with the limited brain data that we do have. And then in addition to this, in order to really test this hypothesis about the fact that improving language model alignment with the brain will help us have better collaboration between AI and humans, we need to not be limited to this kind of passive setting in which current alignment studies usually happen. So we have brain data from people who are passively observing, either reading a text or listening to an audiobook. But we need interactive settings in which humans are actually interacting with the language model, and we're studying the alignment between the two in this interactive setting. And we need to show that this improvement of alignment is actually helpful for this kind of interaction. And now on the second side, which is completely different directions, but also extremely important, and we're also very excited and actively working on this, in how to improve these language models as model organisms for language processing in the brain. Well, first off, we need to answer what are the mechanisms in language models that allow them to develop complex cognition-related capabilities. And this is very tricky because often these models are large, and if we were to use mechanistic interoperability tools, typically those are limited to toy tasks with toy data in small models. So bridging this gap between small models, toy tasks, and toy data to naturalistic data, large models that are capable of complex cognition-related behavior will be quite difficult, right? But it's a worthwhile endeavor and important for really going down this path. And then in addition to this, the question is, okay, even if we're able to describe these mechanisms in language models that are important for these tasks, then how similar are they really to the ones in the brain? So even if on the behavior and representational level we see some similarities, do the mechanisms really have to be similar? And this is an open question, right? So we would need to have ways of investigating that. And then lastly, once we are done with all of this, we still need to, in order to use models as model organisms, we need to develop ways to have new hypotheses about brain mechanisms based on these language models. And this will be another set of challenges, of course. So while we've made some progress towards these questions and we're actively working towards them, I think they're quite challenging, but I'm hopeful that the next 5 years or so will answer at least some of these questions. So that is all from me. I'm looking forward to your questions and discussion, I guess, after Lenka's talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariya, for this super insightful talk. I mean, I'm not from a neuroscience background, but I understood. Yeah, so if you have questions now for Mariya, please just kindly wait until the shared Q&A session. But at the same time, you can just write down your question in the chat anytime, and then you can just speak up during the Q&A session at the end of the meeting. So now let's start with the flash talk. So Lenka is giving a flash talk for us. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Technical University of Denmark. Her research interests include concept-based explainability, exploring representations in hidden layers, human-machine alignment, and translating theory from cognitive science into context of machine learning. And we're all super excited here to learn more about your recent work on convex decision regions in neural representations. With that, I will hand it over to you, Lenka.
Thank you for a kind introduction. I hope you can see my screen now. Yeah, okay. So thank you for having me here today, and I'm excited to talk about the joint work that we did together with my colleagues on convexity in deep neural networks. So you might wonder why convexity is even something that might be interesting to explore in neural networks. Well, the motivation, sorry, my slide. The motivation comes from cognitive science, where mostly a Swedish scientist, Peter Hjernfors, developed a theory on conceptual spaces. And also together with other colleagues, they find out that humans naturally form convex conceptual spaces, and they also find many interesting properties and consequences of the convexity property itself, mostly in terms of generalization. So, for example, we can do interpolation and other geometrical compositions, but it's also very useful for few-shot learning and communication. So this is all known in human cognition, and the natural question arises, is it true also in neural networks? And if so, are also some of these properties and consequences present there? So that's the question that we focus on in this work. But the first thing to do always is to try to see some visualizations to see if there is even a chance that our hypothesis is correct. So here we show some ImageNet classes, and it's a t-SNE plot where each dot is one image. And we have a data two-back model where one is pre-trained, so it's trained in a self-supervised way without ever seeing any of the labels. And then we have a fine-tuned version that was trained to classify into ImageNet classes. And we are interested to see also how these latent representations evolve throughout the layers. So from the first layer, mid one, and then the last one. What is interesting here is that we see that even the pre-trained network that has never seen the labels, it tends to cluster the images belonging to the same class or even similar classes closer together. And it's also something not happening just in the last layer, but it's a process that goes on as the layers evolve in the network. And of course, in the fine-tuned model, we see this more strongly, but that's because the model is trained to do that. But even there, the question still is like, where does this happen and how does it evolve in the network? So this is a nice visualization, but we need to find more ways how to quantify and evaluate correctly the convexity. So that's what we do in the paper. So we start with Euclidean convexity. That's whenever you have 2 points in one set, and then you have also the whole segment between them in the same set, then we can say that the set is convex. So how we evaluate this in the latent representations, we take 2 points that are classified as belonging to the same class, and we sample points on the segment in the latent space between these 2 points, and then we look at the predictions for these sampled points, and then we define the Euclidean convexity score as the proportion of these sampled points that are classified as belonging to the same class. So it's a number between 0 and 1. So this is a nice score, but perhaps not sufficient on its own in neural networks, because there are many works showing that in neural networks, data tend to lay on manifolds. So a simple Euclidean geometry is not enough in this case. So we need to generalize a bit. So first, we need to generalize from Euclidean convexity to geodesic convexity, where we replace the segment by a geodesic. So it's still the shortest path between 2 points, but now we need to walk along the manifold, sort of to respect the geometry. And this cannot be directly evaluated in neural networks because we usually don't have the exact definition of the manifold. So we can only approximate it with the data that we have. And that's why we define what we call graph convexity, where we first form a graph where each point is a vertex, and then we have edges between these points, and they are Euclidean convexity in latent spaces between the 2 points. But the important thing here is that we keep only a certain number of nearest neighbors. In our experiments, we have 10, because locally we can still rely on the Euclidean distances, but not if the points are far away. There we wouldn't walk along the manifold, so we need to use only the close points. So now we can define the graph convexity score as, again, a proportion of the shortest path. So in this case, in shortest path in the graph between 2 points, we measure how many of the points on this path are classified as being in the same class. So now we have 2 scores that are complementary because each of them captures a different property. And we are interested in seeing how they evolve in the networks. So this is a set of results that we have. We tested it on 5 different data modalities, and for each of them we have a pre-trained model, so the one trained in a self-supervised way that has never seen the labels. And then we have fine-tuned models that were trained to classify into the same classes that we evaluate the convexity on. And we measure both scores in each layer. But what I would like to point out here is that we cannot directly compare the results between the modalities, because the scores, as they are defined, they depend on the number of classes. So if there is no convexity at all, then we'll get 1 over the number of classes. And in the modalities, the number of classes varies from 4 to 1,000. So that's why also in these plots, images have the lowest convexity, because there we evaluate 1,000 ImageNet classes. So already the baseline is quite different. But we can still draw some general conclusions. One of them is that we see that in general, the convexity increases throughout the networks, and that also in the fine-tuned models, the convexity is much higher than in the pre-trained ones. But the most important result of the paper is here, that we find relationship between convexity in the pre-trained models and accuracy in fine-tuned ones. So in the figure on the right-hand side, we have a graph where each point is one class, and we explore, here we plot the convexity in the last layer of the pre-trained model and the recall in the fine-tuned model, and we find a strong positive correlation between them. So this plot shows the relation per class, but we also have more results where we average the convexity over the classes. So we have 1 data point for each model, and that's in this plot. So again, we cannot directly compare it in between the modalities because of the different number of classes, but within them we can compare it because there we use the same data to evaluate it. And even when we now edit many more models than before, we still find nice positive correlations. So this result can intuitively be represented as or understood that the convexity is a property that captures how prepared or ready the network is to classify these concepts. And that's something that we've focused on in a follow-up work, where we specifically evaluated audio models. And we consider different types of concepts. So we have words, we have different speakers, and in the paper we also have phonemes. And we wanted to see how the convexity changes in the networks. And in the pre-trained models, which are the full line in the graph, we see that the convexity rises, and then at some point it peaks, and then it gets lower again. And the point where exactly it peaks is different for each type of concepts. So for example, in speakers and also in phonemes, this peak is much earlier in the network. And we think it's because these concepts are much easier. So the network can recognize them earlier in the network. And then it doesn't have to focus on them anymore. So it kind of forgets or does not focus on them. Whereas the words are a bit more complex. So the convexity grows later in the network. And what is interesting in these plots is also that if we fine-tune the models for specific classification tasks, so either for word classification or for speaker classification, we see that the convexity of the relevant concepts gets higher, whereas the convexity of the irrelevant ones gets lower. So for example, when we fine-tune to classify words, it almost completely forgets about the speaker. So it's kind of also nice to see that the pre-trained model, since it doesn't know what task it will need to accomplish, it learns much more. And then once you give it the specific task, it forgets what it doesn't need to know. And what we also did in this paper is that we used the convexity score for pruning layers. So what I now mean by this is that we take the layer where the convexity is highest, so that's the vertical dashed line, and we cut the network at that point and throw away the rest and directly append a linear classifier and fine-tune for the classification task. And what we find here is that we get not only models that are much smaller, but we even get a higher accuracy than in the way that it's usually done, that you append the classifier at the end of the model. Because, for example, with the speakers, at the end, at this point, the network already doesn't know too much about the speaker. The point where it knew the most was at the very beginning. So this graph convexity can be used to find the layer where it is the best to use. So again, capturing that the convexity kind of describes how much ready the network is for the classification now. And a second follow-up work that I would like to just briefly mention is about the relationship between convexity and human-machine alignment, where here in human-machine alignment, we evaluate with odd one out accuracy task. So that's the one where you get a triplet and you need to indicate which of the images is the least similar to the other two. So for humans, we have data from human studies. And for networks, we evaluate cosine similarity in latent spaces. And we want to see how similar the machine responses and the human responses are. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into details, but we found some shared similarities, but also some different behavior. So the relationship is more complex, and I think there needs to be more work done to fully understand it. So to summarize, what I talked about was a workflow that we developed for evaluating convexity in neural networks. And I also showed that we found a lot of convexity among different models and also data modalities. So that links back to the motivation from cognitive science that we as humans tend to represent concepts as convex sets. And we also found a relation between convexity in pre-trained models and accuracy in fine-tuned ones. And interestingly, fine-tuning changes the convexity in both directions, depending on where it's relevant or not. And we can use it as a criterion for choosing the best layer. But there are still many more properties to investigate, both from motivation from the cognitive science, but also other ideas that you can imagine. So I would like to thank all the co-authors. And here we have links to the 3 papers that I mentioned. And the main paper here will soon have an improved journal version. So wait for that one. And we also have a code available. And now we also have a Python package that you can use to easily evaluate convexity of your representations. So thank you for your attention. And now I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Lenka, for the amazing talk. We got a couple of questions in the chat. I think, yeah, just feel free to unmute yourself and directly interact with our speakers. Or should I play the chat board and read the questions for everyone? So yeah, maybe let me read the first question. So we have one question from Marco Femero for Marina. He said, "Thank you very much for the great talk. You mentioned at the beginning of the talk that most methods to measure alignment are linear. While there are a few evidence of some brain regions that might need nonlinear alignment, could you expand on that? Do you think that the field should consider to shift to nonlinear similarity functions?"
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I would say a few years back, there was a lot of interest in investigating this linear versus nonlinear similarity function question. Specifically around the time, I don't know if any of you remember this this point about it was about 2018, 2019 when the first language models came out, BERT specifically, and the whole NLP community was really excited about understanding what properties of language those models really were learning implicitly, even though they were optimized to just predict the next word, right? So this explicit optimization function, but implicitly they're learning, structure of language and like part of speech and all these other things. And so what people were doing were they were essentially doing probing tasks where they're training probing classifiers throughout the layers of the network to reveal what information is processed where in the model. And so in that investigation, they were looking at linear models, so linear probing models, and also nonlinear, like MLPs, for example. And what people found there was that the linear models were quite powerful. The MLPs, of course, were more powerful, so they're able to reach a higher degree of prediction of different properties. But they were also able to memorize a lot. Like the MLP itself was able to memorize. And so it was not clear how much of this final prediction ability was due to really the ability of the model to the ability of the language model to encode these properties, or the ability of the probe to memorize. And so there's, I think John Hewitt and others had some follow up on this to essentially have a statistical test to take care of it. But I think this is a long way to say that people thought about this for some time. And I think for scientific purposes, the linear alignment function is sufficient because it does give us some alignment that's like way above chance that we can play around with and try to understand the reasons for this alignment. But in terms of achieving perfect alignment with the brain, likely this will not be via a linear function. But one thing to consider is that you can also push this nonlinearity earlier in the model, right? It doesn't have to be at the very end. So for example, via brain tuning, we're able to push a nonlinear similarity with the brain to be encoded earlier in the model. It doesn't have to be in the final layer that we attach on the top. And one work maybe that will be useful for you to take a look at was this work by Anya Ivanova and her colleagues that looked at this like linear versus nonlinear mappings and tried to understand how does it map onto some research goals like interpretability and predictivity and so on. This is a work from a few years back now, I think 2022, but I think it will be, if you're interested in this question, you can take a look at that. Yeah, I'll post it here.
Thank you very much, Maria. Sorry if I couldn't read the question before. I didn't make it on time, but thank you for the reference. I'm gonna check it.
Great, thanks.
Okay, for the other questions, Edric, do you just want to speak up?
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I guess I can read my question. Question for Maria. Are there significant differences in brain representations between speech-based and text-based language, considering that speech is heard and text is seen?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so of course, so I would say language processing, you can think of it as a hierarchical process that starts from the parts of the brain that process sensory information. So for listening, this is like early auditory cortex, and for reading, it's early visual cortex. And then the hierarchical process evolves and it goes to, word forms and phonemes in listening, and then we have words and then sentences and so on. And so what we see is that for these earlier areas, of course, we have differences for text-based and for like reading and listening to different language, because we have the early auditory versus early visual cortex. But then as we go further into the processing, the two processes actually converge on the same areas. So you can even use brain activity of people reading to predict brain activity of people listening to the same stimulus in later language regions, so in regions that process semantics. So we do see that these representations are very similar in these late language regions.
Thank you for your answer. My question for Lenka is, do you think there are pathological tasks where convexity in pre-trained models would not promote accuracy in fine-tuned models?
I'm not sure what you mean by pathological tasks. So can you tell a bit more?
So like an example where it's where it goes against the trend where most of the tasks are convexity is good, but like this specific task it doesn't work.
So right now, I don't think so, but it may be possible, and especially it might be the case that we as humans think something is important for a certain task, but the network will think something else is important, and then the trend might be opposite. But right now, I don't have any specific example.
Thank you for your answer.
I think the next question is mine, and I think it's a bit of a question for both of you. I know, Lenka, you mentioned like brain trained models, but I don't know if you exactly looked into what Mariya was looking into. So yeah, my question is, in my understanding, if more convex representation are associated with stronger semantic organization, could we test, or do you expect whether increasing the brain alignment through the brain tuning done by Mariya would result in more convex concept regions? And I guess both of you can answer, and maybe it's a bit speculative, I guess, but
We should collaborate, Lenka.
yeah.
Well, from my side, we can definitely test it. We have the package, so let's do it. And we didn't do anything on the brain. We have just blood cell types in our experiments. So that's an interesting future work.
Yeah, super. I think we should do it.
I mean, I guess like your results indicating you have better semantic performance, Mariya, potentially indicate towards that. It would be cool to see it concretized, maybe.
Agreed, yeah, would be really nice. Yeah, it's always so difficult to evaluate these things, right? So it's kind of the main thing. You come up with a method, you change something in a model, and then really showing what you've done is the tricky part. So this will be a really nice addition as well.
So, is there another question from the audience? Maybe I can ask a pretty naive and quick question to Mariya. So, in your slides, I think page number 18, you mentioned that like brain alignment should also be helpful to answering some like causal questions or helpful with some causal tasks. Could you maybe give a quick example, like which kind of causal analysis are neuroscientists, for example, interested in?
Yeah. I mean, this is a good question. So what I meant by this is sort of, I don't know if you're familiar with mechanistic interpretability work in language models nowadays. It's like the new hot thing to try to interpret what are the mechanisms that allow models to do some kind of task. And so that's what I meant by causal analyses, essentially perturbations or interventions in models that, let's say, ablate different parts or patch different activations to test causal effect on model behavior. So that's kind of the high level goal. Now, exactly what causal analyses would make sense to do, this really depends on the scientific question and what the neuroscientist, let's say, is interested in learning about. But I imagine it being on the order of what is done in mechanistic interpretability, but really more for higher level tasks that are not as toy and are able to be done on naturalistic data, which is like a far cry from the current state of things.
I see. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think it's really closely connected to the sparse mechanism shift, and also in the causality language, where people like can tend to assume that this kind of intervention should only influence the system in a sparse way. I don't know, like I really don't know much about neuroscience, but it sounds like there could be a really nice connection in terms of potential outcome prediction and further other type of causal downstream tasks.
Yeah, this is a really good point. Yes, I think the goal is to have a low dimensional explanation, right, of a mechanism that hopefully is sparse, like you said. So that would make it lower dimension. Because if it's the whole neural network and it's all the parameters of the neural network, we don't really understand what it's doing, right? We can't really describe what the neural network is doing and why it's, let's say, predicting the brain better. And so the goal is to get this like lower dimensional representation that perhaps was obtained via causal methods.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, we have one more question from Sergio. I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. Maybe let's make it the last question. Sergio, do you want to just directly interact with our speaker?
Sure. So my question was related to the spatial resolution and temporal resolution of fMRI data. And how do you deal with synchronizing the speech, the speech when it's heard with the lack of temporal resolution? And then once you do the alignment, I assume that you are averaging different areas of the voxels into a single value, which removes a lot of the spatial resolution. So it's making everything into a single value. And yeah, I was wondering how do you deal with this?
Yes, good question. Let me just share my screen real quick. Let me start with the second question because it's easier to answer. Yeah, so about the spatial resolution, so the way we aggregate results is only at the very end. So it's not, we don't, let's say, predict an entire region. We still predict each x, y, z coordinates, so each voxel. So here, for example, in these results, you can see per voxel changes in brain alignment when we've done some intervention to the model. And so, of course, for these later results that I showed, which were published in machine learning venues, we average across the region and across multiple regions, actually, the language regions, as they're known, in order to have a single value. But we do care about this possible heterogeneity across, even within a region and across regions. But it's more with like scientific mindset rather than an engineering mindset when we do that. So for your first question on the temporal resolution, yes, I mean, you're totally right. The way we deal with this in the brain tuning is that essentially each fMRI image, like you said, is covering multiple words. And so we take the audio clip that is associated with so for one audio clip, which is, it can vary in terms of number of words, but it's about 2 seconds because each fMRI image is taken every 2 seconds. And so for an audio clip that's 2 seconds, we have the corresponding brain image, which we then use to tune the model parameters in order to predict it better. And we've also tried larger windows, so not just the 2 seconds that correspond to this image, but also the last 20 or so seconds. And we see that actually that improves the ability to predict the brain and to brain tune the model. So we do see that context does matter. But this is how we deal with this. Of course, we cannot get image temporal resolution, right? We cannot get like word level or phoneme level resolution with fMRI. For that, you would need something like MEG or ECOG or EEG, something that has a much higher temporal resolution. And that is something that we want to do in the future as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Let's thank our speakers again for their amazing talks, and also thank you everyone for joining. But before we conclude the session today, I would like to quickly advertise for our next appointment, which is in about 2 weeks. On the 8th of July, we will meet again at 4 p.m. Central European Summer Time. And this time we will have Victor Veach from University of Chicago and Google DeepMind as our keynote speaker, and Luigi Gesele from University of Copenhagen as our flash talk speaker. So yeah, thank you everyone again for joining. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.